policy that is impacting their lives.
And we had your executive director, Daniel Turner, on about 6 or so months ago. Just really a great interview, discussion. He was very animated and very fun, New York street fighter kind of guy. But this is your first time on the podcast, and talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing within your organization.
Sure. And so, I'll just try to keep it real succinct for you, but I grew up in Silver City. I'm from New Mexico, graduated high school here, and my career here spans being a reporter, both in broadcast and print. And then also I spent some time in the administration of Governor Martinez, both in education and energy. And then also being her communications director, I had great opportunities there. And so after that opportunity, I had the chance to work with Daniel. We met about not quite a year ago, actually, and he was talking about Power of the Future and what he saw happening nationally and what he saw the influence of a lot of concentrated folks. When I say concentrated folks, I'm talking about out-of-state billionaires who are influencing policy at a state level for policies that aren't beneficial to people who are working in that state, who are paying the bills in that state. And so he started Power of the Future and asked if I would join as his Western States Director, which I have enthusiastically done. Personally, I have 5 kiddos, which people kind of sit back and say, wow, okay, when they take a look at me. And my wife and I live here with our family, and so we are directly impacted by the policies that happen here in our state. And so with Power of the Future, what we are looking at is advocating for the energy workers who we have it there on the website, and I think it's a great way of saying it. The energy workers who, whenever we turn the light, whenever we plug in the device that's playing this podcast, the energy that's, making this possible now, those are the energy workers that have made that possible. And whenever we do those things, it's a thank you to them for making that possible. And not only that, they make our way of life here in New Mexico and in the United States possible, from powering our hospitals, public services, any number of things that need power. They make it happen for all of us. And on top of that, I'm sure you know well the revenue that they deliver here to the state of New Mexico along with that. And so it is a twofold massive benefit to the state of New Mexico, and it's under attack. And we would argue it's under attack solely for political purposes. They come at you saying it's environmental purposes, and we don't believe that's true. We believe that we can have a strong environment and a strong economy that depends upon affordable energy, and New Mexicans shouldn't have to make that choice, and yet some folks are making us do that. And so we highlight the intersections of where that influence is peddled and what decisions are made after that influence is peddled.
So before we get into all the various New Mexico issues that you're working on in your job, it is unique that you have someone dealing with the West. I don't know, does that include California and Oregon?
It does. Okay. Technically, I'm over Colorado and California as well. Absolutely.
So it's very rare in any line of work, politics or corporate or government affairs, whatever it might be, that someone chooses New Mexico as their headquarters to deal with the West, because normally, I'm sure you have experienced this as well. It's somebody flying in when they're dealing with New Mexico. Well, they're coming out of the Denver office, or maybe Austin, Texas, or Dallas, or Phoenix, or whatever. Besides all of the things going on in New Mexico, what other states are you watching? What other places are similar issues being discussed right now, or things that you're involved in those other states?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so just to get through the logistics of it, Power of the Future, you've met Daniel. He is our national director based out of Washington, D.C., and watches national issues, much like the Green New Deal that we've been watching a whole lot. Another area where we take a look at, not me specifically, but we have a state director there, and he does a great job, is in Alaska, another energy-rich state. And then we have myself down here with watching, New Mexico, as I mentioned, Colorado and California. And so to your question of what are we watching? Well, we're watching where things that, and you've seen it as well, Paul, strategies that often get employed in one place, if it works, then they start spreading those strategies on all sides of any issue. And so when we see something start to happen in New Mexico, when we see something start to happen in Alaska or Colorado, or even at the national level in Washington, D.C., we start to see the patterns of those things and start to recognize, who is maybe influencing them. And it's usually not the local population. It's usually coming from an out-of-state influence that is trying to move their agenda forward in New Mexico. And I know all of that is familiar to you. I'm not giving you any new news there. But to the things we're looking at nationally, Green New Deal, obviously. That is a law that has been proposed, and I'd be glad to talk about where the New Mexico delegation has stood on it and what it means for New Mexico. But we were very proud just last week to release the first of its kind study to show what it costs families, an average household in 5 different states, including New Mexico. So to your point, it's not often New Mexico gets included kind of in the first run of those things. But I mean, other states such as Alaska, we did it for Pennsylvania, Florida as well. And you'll have to forgive me, I forget the 5th off the top of my head, but New Mexico was included in that. And when you see that all the things that a household would have to do to come into compliance with the Green New Deal, if it were to pass and become law, would cost that family nearly $72,000 just in a single year. Not over their lifetime, not over 5 years, $72,000 in the first year. And then about $44,000 every year after that. That's to retrofit their home, retrofit the things that they currently use that provide their energy, get that electric vehicle, all the things that folks, I think maybe if they feel good about the Green New Deal, don't know what's specifically in it, that it's going to cost our economy. And so to take that to kind of a higher point, to retrofit all the residential square space, in New Mexico, that's about 1.8 trillion square feet of residential space. It is $350 billion to come into compliance with the Green New Deal. And so the numbers are so astronomical, you have to wonder if it's a serious proposal at all. You have to wonder if it's something that they feel is really going to happen, or they just wanted to find something that can exert their power a little more.
And this is the proposal nationwide by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her cohort, but has also been signed on to by, I know, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, current Secretary of State, as well as candidate for the U.S. Senate. Deb Haaland, is she on board with the National New Deal?
She is. So kind of an interesting display of how the congressional delegation did it. Congresswoman Haaland signed onto it as soon as it was dropped. And so she was there from the get-go. Congressman Ben Ray Lujan waited sometimes. I want to say about 3 to 4 months. And I'm not for sure when Senator Udall announced his retirement and when Congressman Lujan announced his candidacy, but I wonder if it was within that time that he decided to sign on to the Green New Deal. So he signed on about the beginning of May to the Green New Deal, waiting some time to do that. Congresswoman Torres Small has yet to sign on to it, which we find very interesting. And then if you look at New Mexico's 2 senators, Senator Heinrich and Senator Udall, they did something somewhat interesting in Washington. I'm sure you know. Mitch McConnell brought it up for a vote. He said, if you feel this is the answer and we have to act urgently, let's vote on it right now. And lo and behold, in the U.S. Senate, the Green New Deal did not get a single vote in favor. It had 2 New Mexico senators who have told us over and over that we have to act now. We have no time to waste. The time to act on climate is now. They voted present.
And, the details of the Green New Deal at the national level are, you really require a significant exercise to go and look at all the different aspects of it, because, it talks about reducing to elimination plane travel.
Yep.
There's, as you said, the retrofitting of buildings. The whole society would be completely reorganized under the National Green New Deal. And, just to be clear, Ben Ray Lujan is still the congressman from northern New Mexico. Deb Haaland, of course, represents the Albuquerque area and environs. Xochitl Torres Small has not signed on, and the 2 sitting U.S. senators have taken a pass on that particular issue. So a very, we have a very left-wing delegation in this state, and despite New Mexico being a major energy producer, our members of Congress are attacking the very hand that feeds the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And they do it as as I started out saying, in the name of the environment. Well, if the environment's so important, you don't just vote present. If the environment's so important, Congressman Lujan, who has been given the title of Assistant Speaker, I don't know what powers that comes with in the Constitution. I have a feeling it's a title that maybe Speaker Pelosi gave to him for some reason. But you would think there in leadership of the U.S. House of Representatives, now that he's signed on, there would be an opportunity for him to bring it up for a vote and see where they stand. And if it's not really then that urgent, then how urgent is everything else that they keep telling us? Then how urgent is all the other problems they say are associated that we need to pass the Green New Deal? And you're you're exactly right. There is a ton in that bill that is more along the social change aspect of it. I believe universal basic income is in there as well. And things that really, I think the average New Mexican would be hard pressed to figure out what does that have to do with the environment. And so much so that the sponsor's chief of staff was caught being honest with a reporter around and said, that bill originally wasn't about the environment. It was about changing the American economic system. And I think that's what it's really about, is taking more control, would be my point of view.
And, kind of taking this down to the state level, you have your group, Power of the Future, has compared the Energy Transition Act to the National Green New Deal. And something I noticed online, you probably noticed as well, is that PNM's CEO, Vincent Colon, I guess that's how you pronounce her name, but she made a substantial donation to Ben Ray Lujan in his campaign for the U.S. Senate. And of course, PNM is at the center of New Mexico's Green New Deal. It's not quite in scope as ambitious, but in terms of the legislation itself, it is extremely transformative of how we get electricity in the state and how the state's economy and energy grid are organized. So why don't we talked about the Energy Transition Act probably more than any other single topic on this podcast, but how do you see that, and how did you come up with the creative approach of labeling it the Green New Deal, and kind of give us your thoughts on that issue?
Well, as far as the label, I'd like to take credit, but that was actually CBS News who called it a mini Green New Deal when it passed here. And I think folks were really enthusiastic. The supporters of it were really enthusiastic when that happened. And now that they've seen what's happened with the Green New Deal, and that we've been able to, through some of our work, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the great work that you're doing, following PNM's meetings and following the ETA, Energy Transition Act, and its impact on New Mexicans. I think more and more people are starting to see what the impact of this bill is. But to the point, we wanted to take a look at who had the influence here, who wanted to push this, why did they want to push it? And what we did was, I did a simple, and you've done them as well, a simple records request. And we asked, hey, can you just give us all the emails between top level officials discussing the Energy Transition Act? And lo and behold, we found National Resources Defense Council, we found Sierra Club, we found Conservation Voters in New Mexico, and we found other environmental entities there, along with legislative leaders and leaders in the governor's administration as they crafted the Energy Transition Act. What we didn't find were ratepayers represented. What we didn't find were small businesses in the oil and gas or in the energy industry who are providing jobs and delivering that surplus. We didn't find any of that.
Right. Well, that's obvious, because it was the goal of the environmental groups, not average people who wanted this kind of thing. Now, I take it your point with that is that it just illustrates where the power is coming from, where the sway is coming from in order to get this law enacted. You're not saying there's anything inherently, say, illegal about this, or are you? Do you think it's illegal?
No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is that we have over 100,000 workers in New Mexico that work in the energy industry in some capacity or for another. And what they do is they deliver affordable energy that's powering everything that makes our way of life possible here in New Mexico. And by the way, has made us an exporter in what we deliver to the world, and by the way, has also helped the United States be more secure in energy independence.
So just to be clear, these meetings, you're not saying there's anything necessarily illegal about them, just untoward.
Well, yeah, that's how I'd qualify it. But let's be clear. We had our Secretary, I said Secretary of Energy. It's Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, which is too long to say. So I say Secretary of Energy. We had our Secretary of Energy asking to have her former employer, a green organization, go over specifics of the bill before any New Mexico ratepayer got to take a look at it. And so now imagine if the roles were reversed on that. Imagine that if it was a former executive of, say, Chevron, not to single out Chevron or anything, but they said, before this landmark energy bill passes, make sure my folks at Chevron take a look at it. There would be up in arms here in New Mexico. There would be probably hearings on it. There would be a look into, where that went with ethics and so forth. But here, it didn't get a whole lot of attention because I think that, it's getting more attention now. But I think that when folks look at bills like this, they want to know who is peddling that influence and what that is delivering. And I think, the more light that is shined on it, we're going to find that the people who are making the difference, the energy workers in New Mexico and the ratepayers, are the ones that are being left out of the discussion.
No doubt about it. And, I can speak from experience having attended hearings on the Energy Transition Act during the session. There was nobody aside from, us there to talk about the ratepayer issue. It was all about, and they brought the bodies to illustrate their power. So they have the money, the environmental groups do, and they also have the boots on the ground. There's no organization aside from us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In this room, this is what accounts for, defense of the ratepayers and the workers in New Mexico's energy economy, especially utility workers in this particular case. So I guess, for lack of a better word, this is the way politics is done so often, is that if you have the power, you can impose your will. And unfortunately, New Mexicans have elected these people who clearly would rather take their marching orders from Tom Steyer and these environmental groups than the workers here. I know it's frustrating, it's upsetting, but until the rest of us organize and get the same money behind us, this is the way it's going to happen. I hate to be fatalistic. It seems like they just have that power, and I know we're trying to educate people, but
sure. And so I can hear a little frustration there, and I agree with you. That frustration can get worked in pretty easy. And I don't know if this will help or hurt with the frustration, but let me take it a step further. What we know is when you pass things like the Energy Transition Act, and they have passed similar mandates in California, what you see is electric rates go up. It costs money to build new infrastructure that goes with all this new energy, which, by the way, is not always reliable. And so you still need a backup of carbon-based energy so far that, no one's been able to do it to 100%. So we look at places like California where rates went up and they had blackouts. And we look at places like Germany who is not a small economy, is not an insignificant nation in terms of monetary power. And they were going to lead the way to do it. And now they're turning back to things like coal because they figured out it just cannot work. The economics don't work on it. But when we bring up those warning signs, we're told, and PNM responded to one of my op-eds about it, and they said, those aren't good examples. Renewables are cheaper. University of Chicago says it's not. University of Chicago took a look at it and said, when you start going down this road, it raises rates about 17%. And so I don't know, I know they're pretty tax happy right now in Santa Fe, but even at their tax happy state right now, I don't know if they could pass a 17% increase, but yet that's what it's done with the ETA. It's going to raise the rates of hardworking New Mexicans to be able to embrace this type of energy, which is not reliable and that nowhere else has been able to do. It is kind of the backwards, we always say what has, worked elsewhere won't work in New Mexico. And we're trying to say, well, this will work just in New Mexico when it hasn't worked anywhere else. And I think reality shows us that that's not the case. But to the larger frustration part, I think New Mexicans are becoming more aware. Keep in mind, this happened pretty fast. This was a landmark energy transition for every New Mexican. It's going to reach into every household in the state. It was introduced early February and passed by the end of the session. So within, 6 weeks, it was passed. And so as more light is shed on it, I think you're going to see more New Mexicans start to realize what is happening in the state, and more actions come from it too.
So there's a lot of different interest groups at play, but part of the frustration, I guess, is that even if you combine our two groups, say Heartland Institute, Heritage Foundation, all the big conservative think tanks, the amount of money that they are able to raise is dwarfed several times over by the big environmental groups, and yet we're the ones who are, Koch brothers and shills for big oil and all this rigmarole. And it's just, I don't know that there's any way to fight back, especially given our smaller platform, until New Mexicans and others see the real impact on their electricity bills. And we can say, as we've said on the Rail Runner and the Spaceport and all these other government boondoggles, we told you so. And then it becomes, how do you put things back in the right way? And I think that's kind of the frustration point that I'm expressing to you.
And that's where you're exactly right. And that's where it turns scary, right? Because we can look at towns in Appalachia and that economic hole, once it's learned that we probably shouldn't have abandoned this opportunity, that economic hole is not filled again. That town's abandoned. People have gone. People have lived there for generations, have had to move on and figure something else out. And unfortunately, we see a little bit of that in the Four Corners, right? We see that happening where the way of life there is under attack from folks on the outside. And I hear, and I'm not sure you hear a lot, but I hear that, well, we're just New Mexico. There's no way Michael Bloomberg or Tom Steyer is interested in us. Well, Michael Bloomberg, I can tell you, as we sit here today, is funding 2 attorneys in the New Mexico Attorney General's office. Those attorneys are there tasked with implementing his agenda. And when I say funding, he is paying their salaries.
Yeah, if the Koch brothers did that, people would be up in arms. And the Journal made that point in an editorial that, this does not work both ways when it comes to, any multi-billionaire just funding positions in government. It's just insane.
And they also pointed out, he's funded campaigns in Santa Fe for a soda tax. He funded campaigns here in New Mexico against the Second Amendment. So to say New Mexico is not big enough on the radar to have that influence is just not true. And I think that's part of the obstacle. Sometimes people feel that, well, we're New Mexico, there's no way. Well, I think we're finding out that, yes, there's a lot of money flowing into New Mexico from out of state. And I know you follow what goes on in the Four Corners as well. And there's a group that's been up there for years, San Juan Citizens Alliance. And we've done a look at them. 97% of their money comes from outside New Mexico.
Yeah, well, just kind of looking at the situation, you consider your dark blue states, and quite frankly, to a great extent, the environmental groups and their allies have already won those battles in California and Vermont and most of those states. New Mexico is a prize, but because of the sparse population, media markets, et cetera, it's not a high price tag to get into the game here. You can put a boots on the ground, put a campaign together, but it is a major energy state across the board. And if they can take a scalp from one of these states that actually really does produce and rely on that energy, that's a big thing for a Bloomberg or a Steyer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the Green New Deal, which appears not to be going anywhere in Washington, one of New Mexico's senators, as he got up on that vote, bemoaned the fact that he had to vote for the bill that apparently I thought he would support. And he said, we should look at something like we have the Energy Transition Act in New Mexico. That's what we should really be looking at. And then you start to see how that influence moves, right? You start to see it's like, well, maybe if we can't get Green New Deal, we can have a test case in New Mexico. Well, they got it through there. What other states here may be open and have the same kind of layout and the same kind of issues at hand that maybe we can get it through in other states as well. And the next thing you know, it starts to go a state to state type strategy as opposed to a national strategy. And the impact on the ratepayers and energy workers is the same. They lose jobs and prices go up.
Yeah, and just on that Washington, D.C. discussion, I spent time in the D.C. area. What Mitch McConnell did was kind of put up or shut up time in the Senate. Of course, he's a Republican, doesn't support the Green New Deal. He could just have that bill in whole cloth put onto the floor. If the House were serious halfway about having a real discussion about the Green New Deal, they would be having hearings. The Democrats control this. This is Nancy Pelosi, and AOC is in that group, and they would be having these hearings and really hammering out the details. But as you're right, it shows that they're completely unserious about it. It's at best a vague set of talking points.
Yeah, and Congresswoman Hadland, I believe, is vice chair on the Natural Resources Committee. Has she asked for a hearing on Green New Deal as a supporter of it? Again, as we mentioned, Congressman Lujan, as assistant speaker, has he asked for this bill to be moved if he is a supporter of it? And so it's really interesting to see the the contradiction of saying it's the environment, we have to act now, time is running out. But then they're in control of one chamber there in Washington. There's nothing stopping them from bringing that up for a vote, and yet there's no vote.
So let's take this back to the Energy Transition Act in New Mexico. And, of course, if it was just radical environmentalists willing to go along with this kind of thing, and I realize the state's Republican Party, the legislators on the GOP side, a lot of them have been beaten up, and all their pressure comes from the left, not the right. We saw a number of Republicans vote in favor of this. We saw PNM overtly lobbying for the Energy Transition Act. We all have our opinions and views about this issue within politics and, of course, corporate special interests. Talk about PNM and talk about kind of these issues and what happened during the session, and then how you would like to see this discussion play out.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, one of the things I noticed when I got that batch of emails that we were talking about was the exact first one I noticed that caught my attention was the one from PNM's lobbyist. And she sent an email and it was after the bill had passed. They sent emails to legislative leaders, governor administration officials, and it was just a glowing thank you note. And it said, we're so grateful you're taking us in this direction. We're going to need your clarity and vision as we take these steps. And then, of course, as you know, on Earth Day, they held a press conference to say, we're going to meet these requirements even earlier than the bill requires. Now, they didn't mention that, I believe it's about 7 natural gas plants around the state where there are people employed across New Mexico. PNM saying we're going to get rid of those. That's not going to be part of our portfolio anymore. Of course, the San Juan Generating Station is not going to be part of their portfolio anymore. And so their defense on that seems to be, we were going to do that anyway. And so you have this back and forth of an interesting corporate interest along with these environmental groups that are working into building this law, and they were very enthusiastic about it without really giving other people, and I'm going to keep saying it, giving other people a chance to speak in, because I think if they had, they would find there was going to be less enthusiasm. And to your point, they're holding meetings now. I pointed out this email in an op-ed, and I pointed out the University of Chicago study, and I've said, you're hearing one thing from PNM, who was an enthusiastic supporter of this bill, as you mentioned, but the science just doesn't show that it goes that way. It shows that as we move that way, that bills go up, and you never reach the goals that are there, and order to 50% by such and such date and so forth. And by the time that you realize you can't reach those goals, the energy workers have lost their jobs, communities have lost populations, and the devastation economically has been done. And the politicians who passed it then are not around to have to, bear the brunt of what is happening. It's the families that bear the brunt of what is happening with it. And so to have then PNM come back and say, trust us, we're going to be different. You're going to be able to save an average of $7 on your bill. And they responded to, to that op-ed saying, of course we have public input. We're going to hold meetings like the one you attended, Paul. And, to me, that was like, well, it's like the doctor saying, I've already decided I'm going to amputate one of your limbs, but we're going to hold meetings to decide which one. And that's exactly it. They'll hold public hearings after the fact. Where were these public meetings beforehand to let folks have the input? And I think they know what would have transpired at those meetings, and so that's why they never occurred. And so it's an interesting, it's an interesting shift for them to say, of course we're transparent, we're holding hearings. Well, the bill's passed. It is law as we sit here today.
And of course, PNM has an incentive financially,
absolutely,
to see higher rates, not lower rates, because they get a baked in profit margin by the PRC and the legislation that passed. And so they're a heavily regulated utility. They're by no means a private sector actor, acting in a free market and competing. So it's worth noting that. And by the way, Larry, I'm going to show you this real quick,
okay.
But I have been personally blocked by
Why?
PNM on Twitter.
Why?
I guess
say?
You asked the wrong questions,
and
you might wind up getting blocked. It's the first entity. I've gone toe to toe with more politicians in this state than I could count. Oh, not just on the left, but I've crossed some Republicans in my day, and nobody has seen fit to block yours truly on Twitter until PNM.
Well, tell you what, how about the day this podcast lands, I will tweet at them and I will ask them why they're blocking you.
That sounds like a great idea.
Let's just do that so they can hear the podcast and answer the question at the same time.
There you go. Well, lots more we could talk about on Energy Transition Act, but I think energy workers in New Mexico as an energy state, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. Of course, oil and gas. When you think energy, you think New Mexico, oil and gas. That's, we're third largest state in the country in terms of producing. It funds such a big component of our state's budget. How long do you think it'll take for the environmental groups, now that they've kind of chewed up and spat out the San Juan generating station?
Mm-hmm.
When do you think, or who's next? You think it's oil and gas? You think they're going to go mining, or what other areas of our economy, and how quickly will they come after them, the environmental movement?
Oh, that's a great question. And so before I get to that, I hear you on the San Juan generating station, and you know as well as I do, there's a company that has at least proposed to come in and say, we can work the San Juan generating station and we can work it in a way that is within the parameters of the Energy Transition Act. And PNM says, we're not going to buy a single electron from them.
Yeah. And we're going to have them on at some point on the podcast.
Yeah, and I think that's really telling, right? If it isn't about the environment, you guys have set these, what I would call overly rigorous and not helpful standards, but a company has said, you know what, we could still make it work and keep people employed, and they said, no, that's not good enough for us. But to your point, and it goes to where we're kind of, I come from philosophically. I come from Southwest New Mexico. Mining is a big deal. I didn't see a pump jack, I think, until I was maybe early into my 20s. And so I'm still learning on that aspect, but I definitely saw a pit mine way before then.
I think they instead of a sign, welcome to Silver City, you just see the big open pit mine there, the Chino mine. And I guess I've got, two Silver City ites. Is that what they call them? Wally, of course, being a
we just say awesome. We just use the word awesome.
All right.
That said, and so we've seen, and you hit on it earlier when we talk about, are we watching things in other states? The strategies they use in different industries, and I'm going to put agriculture in there as well. We've seen it with ranching and farming and dairy farming and so forth. The strategies that get used there are then, if they work, strategies that are employed in other aspects of, the industries that the other eco left just does not like. And it doesn't matter if it is, allowing a community to stay together. It doesn't matter if it's providing income for the community. And it doesn't matter if it's allowing families to stay together multi-generationally. These are, and this is where I get kind of worked up about it, these are families that choose to live in these parts of New Mexico, probably because that's where they grew up and that's where their parents and grandparents are. That's where they want to raise their children. And these industries offer them opportunities to stay there and to not have to choose between, do we live close to grandma and grandpa, or do we go closer to an urban area? And when these organizations from places like Santa Fe and New York and San Francisco come after these industries for the sole reason other than political power, because I think we've demonstrated it's not about the environment, then it really gets me worked up, because it is a way of life, and it is a rural way of life that folks have chosen to live. And this is coming in to solely disrupt it by people who would probably never ever go to Silver City, never ever go to Artesia. I've never seen Michael Bloomberg in Artesia. Tom Steyer's not showing up in Silver City. And so, but yet the money they're pouring into our state has an impact in those areas. But to get really specific to your question, we saw it, right? During the legislative session, we saw mining under attack as well. And Southwest New Mexico stood up. Republicans, Democrats, independents, all across the board, and said, no, this is what supports our community, and we will continue to stand for it. 1,000 people showed up at a meeting in Silver City to stand against the bills that were going in the legislature against mining. Party lines didn't matter. Ideologically didn't matter. It was about making a difference for a community. And I think you're going to see, and when we kind of get to that frustrating, and are they hearing, and do they understand, and it's just us, when I see something like that helps me feel better about the fact that people in New Mexico are waking up to who is having influence over them, and that it's not always best for their community.
Yeah, and mining is something that, of course, funds a lot of New Mexico, and it's a big thing that happens, especially in your former area of the state, Southwest New Mexico. But of course, oil and gas is the big one that we're known for as a state. And to be fair, we've seen one legislative session of kind of progressive rule in the state, and oil and gas made its way through relatively unscathed. It kind of, hammering down on that point, how do you see this battle royale playing out? Do you think we'll just know more after, say, 2020, when people like John Arthur Smith and Mary Kay Papin are going to be targeted by the progressives? Like, give me some crystal ball here. I know it's tough, but we know the oil and gas is on the hit list. That is the big kahuna that the left wants to go after.
It is. I can tell you what makes me nervous. When you see a bill that is banning hydraulic fracking, and everyone says, oh, well, we know that bill's never going to get passed. Well, you know as well as I do, Paul, that's how it starts, right? And something that is outrageous in the 2019 session maybe sounds more reasonable by the 2021 session. And that's something that I think, if I were a small business owner in the Roswell area working in the energy industry, I would want to take a look at something like that and say, is that something I'm gonna have to deal with in 3 to 4 years? And as I make my hiring decisions, as I make my where I'm gonna invest in the business or not decisions, I think I start looking at things like that and say, is that the climate that I'm gonna have to operate in? And so I'm very curious to see how it's going to go. I think it's going to, my 2 cents, it's going to become more overt. You have Michael Bloomberg, who has gone from a Beyond Coal campaign to a Beyond Carbon campaign. And so that puts in natural gas as well. Mayor Tim Keller has signed on to it and said, we're going to go beyond carbon here in Albuquerque. That is someone saying, I am directly trying to get rid of these jobs. And that is New Mexico's economy right now. And I think, it's a lot of folks may listen to this and say, well, you're not accounting, and it happened in mining too. You're not counting for the bus times, and you're only, talking about this because things are good now. Our point of view is bills like Green New Deal, Energy Transition Act, pick winners and losers. They are forcing New Mexicans to go in a direction that maybe New Mexicans don't want to go on their own, and not letting the market choose which direction it goes. If technology comes through and something works out great, I think we should have every opportunity to provide for that and embrace that. However, it is clear right now that carbon-based fuel is keeping our environment in a decent spot for a lot of places across New Mexico. I mean, understanding there's not always great actors in a lot of things, and also providing jobs and providing income for the state. And when I say keeping the environment in a decent spot, I can probably hear, a few things turn off, but let me just point to this, because this was the argument that came against the ranchers as well, of saying you're just tearing up the land. And ranchers would tell me, this is the land I live on, and the cattle I run is my livelihood. Why would I tear up that land? And it's the same for our energy workers. This is the land their family lives on. Their children breathe that air and drink that water. They care about getting it done right.
No doubt about it. And I know it's good to fight along allies like you and try to defend these ways of life here in New Mexico. Kind of taking a last issue that is often not dealt with, but there is a nuclear storage facility that's on the drawing board for Southeast New Mexico. We're talking jobs. We're talking a way to store and dispose of some of the byproducts of nuclear energy production. Has your organization engaged on the Holtec facility at all? We haven't. No, it's just not something we've engaged on. I could talk to you a bit about it. In terms of my former position in the administration, I had dinner in my time in the foreign administration with the former Energy Secretary Moniz from President Obama, and their plan was saying, listen, if communities have shown us that they have a desire to have this in their area, then it's something we're going to look at. That was the Obama administration doing that. And down in southeast New Mexico, they have shown that desire. But for some reason, Santa Fe wants to impose the will on southeast New Mexico. And so, again, it is an opportunity, I think, for jobs, and it is an opportunity that is being undermined by people who have the luxury of distance.
of it, right? They have the luxury of just getting the money from the Southeast and the power from the Southeast. And they don't have to worry about the consequences of what they're proposing, whereas the folks in the Southeast have to worry about that. And so I think if you would ask folks down there, from what I've seen, they would embrace something like whole tech.
Yeah, and it kind of calls a little BS on folks like Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, who claim to be doing all this on the merits of the environment and clean air and zero carbon and blah, 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 when if you suddenly throw out nuclear, you hear a lot of crickets.
You really do, don't you? That's carbon free.
Yeah. But, and it's more jobs for Southeast New Mexico. Unfortunately, at this point, the governor and land commissioner have taken a contrary position on it. We'll see what happens. And I guess if there's, before we conclude, if there's anything these recent Democratic presidential debates have shown us, it's that Obama was way, way too moderate for these folks. I don't know. Obama's looking like basically Mitt Romney Republican as far as these guys are concerned. It's unbelievable how far this discussion has shifted to the left on almost every front.
Well, from our point of view, and Daniel says this, and I absolutely agree, the proposals, it is amazing to me, the proposals that come out, and I'll just take it to energy and the environment here. Every quote-unquote solution that is brought forth is one that gives more power to government. It gives less power to the rest of us in terms of what we're free to choose and what we're free to do. And that is every solution coming down from them, and I see that on the stage in the Democratic debates as well. Their solutions are not about empowering New Mexicans and Americans to make their own decisions and go their own way. It's about only choosing their way. And that is concerning to me, and I also think shows to real motivations.
No doubt about it. I think Coolio said it best. It's the money and the power. And that is just
of all the quotes I did expect to hear during this podcast. I did expect
got to throw something.
The Coolio reference coming my way. Okay, all right.
There you go. All right, Larry. Well, folks can find out more about your organization. How?
PowerTheFuture.com. We're also on Twitter. The New Mexico Power the Future is PTF New Mexico. We'd love to engage with folks there, and hopefully we won't get blocked.
Yeah, we'll have that discussion a little later with PNM. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.